Welcome to the One Shot Show, where GMs go to level up. We are your favorite NPCs. My name is Mock.
My name is Matt.
And we're here to talk about interesting NPCs. How do you make them? How do you run them? Matt, do you have any opinions?
I'm actually just shocked by the revelation from you just now that I'm not a real boy.
You do actually have like a loop of different pieces of dialogue that we've just been cycling through this whole time.
That reminds me of something I read in the Odyssey, actually.
Oh.
The way I make memorable NPCs, personally, is I make it very clear to my players from the outset whether or not they're supposed to give a shit about this NPC.
How do you do that?
Well, if they're not meant to give a shit about them, they call them something like Bill. Truly, that's the tell. If it's like, this is Greg the farmer, they're not going to waste any time on Greg the farmer.
Okay.
But if I'm like, the man introduces himself as Slegathor, they're going to be like, let's find out a little bit more about Slegathor.
Okay, now I have a lot of examples of my personal experience of the Boblin the Goblin phenomenon.
Yeah,
where
Crentus the dentist.
Yes,
Yeah.
you walk into a tavern. In one corner is a necromancer in a shadowy hood with a crown of fire around his head, holding a set of jewels, and the players ask, who else is in here? And you go, great, in the corner there's a goblin, guess his name is Boblin. And then immediately they're going to go straight for that. So let's say you have been put on the spot, you need to come up with somebody compelling, they've got to have like a name and a backstory. Are there things that you fall on to make that character feel real or feel engaging?
I mean, I talk about simulated realism.
You do.
As being a thing that I do in my games.
You also
This is
talk
one of
about
my-
calling all of your NPCs Bill.
Yeah, this is one of my other recycled lines is simulated realism. Look, by the time my players are in a location, you know, I've already got a bit of an idea of what that location is and the sorts of people that are likely to be there. You know, if they're in a small farming town tavern and look, here's this clearly interesting person, and they're like, is anyone else in the tavern? I'm like, yeah, there's a couple of, couple of farmers who are, you know, obviously in for a quick drink to sort of catch up on the local news. They seem to be busy chatting. You know, there's one who's a bit of an older gentleman. There's a couple of younger blokes who might be farmhands.
Your cheat code is to say, I'm going to describe one person specifically. I'm going to give them a name like, what was it, Slegathor?
Slegathor, yeah. That's what I went
Slegathor.
for, yeah.
Going to give them a name like Slegathor.
I actually recently got a really useful trick, by the way, for elf names.
Ooh, go on.
They should sound like the official names for pharmaceuticals. It is I, clonazepam. It's me, diaxethylamine.
Come
What's
and
the
see
trick?
my Lord Viagra.
Yeah.
So that is a
The
fantastic
generic
tip.
name for which is sildenafil. In case you want. And truly, if you can slip sildenafil into your games without your players noticing, truly, it's just, that's the thing, it's just plausible enough. If you're like, the dean of the magical academy is an old elf called sildenafil. And no
Okay.
one will bat an eyelid.
Now, I have a different thing that I like to use, because you're like, I'm
Other
going
than Viagra? What's your trick?
Other than
We're keeping that in.
specifically describing one person and saying there's a crowd in the background, but they're kind of like out of focus, and giving them a name. A really good trick to have is to have one specific thing that this character has. It might be peg leg, eye patch, specific accent, interesting scar. And this is a tried and true thing that authors for years and years and years
Name one.
have used. I'm going to name Michael Moorcock, and in
Wow.
fact, I have here in the studio with me now one of my very favorite books, The Jewel in the Skull, where on page 1, Michael Moorcock is about to introduce a very important NPC. I'm going to give you a dramatic reading. I hope you're ready. The sky was a light grey, carrying rain, and from it shone sunlight of watery gold, touching the Count's armour of burnished brass and making it glow like flame. The Count wore a huge broadsword at his hip, and a plain helmet, also of brass, was on his head. His whole body was sheathed in heavy brass, and even his gloves and boots were of brass links sewn upon leather. The Count's body was broad, sturdy, and tall, and he had a great strong head on his shoulders, with a tanned face that might also have been moulded of brass. From this head stared two steady eyes of golden brown. His heavy moustache was red, as was his hair. In the realm, as well as beyond it, it was not unusual to hear the legend that the Count was, in fact, not a true man at all, but a living statue in brass. This is a famous and professional writer who has just used that exact technique to make sure that we do not fucking forget Count Brass. In fact, he wrote a whole book about Count Brass.
It's called Count Brass. I love that.
The literal name. You can have a guy with an eye patch and just call him Eye Patch. Do it.
Yeah. And of course, Count Brass's signature catchphrase, your ass is brass and I'm going to buff it. But you raise a valid point. Honestly, sometimes it doesn't have to go any further than they have a thing.
Yep.
And one of the things that you brought up is their accent, their voice. Something that's actually what I mostly do to distinguish the importance from the unimportance.
You make a really, really good point about just like one thing absolutely being enough, because when you're meeting people in the real world very briefly, you might only come away with one or two things. For example,
Maybe someone spells the name with an X instead of a CK and that sticks out to you.
And that sticks out. Or maybe they meet you and you're like, wow, this guy really likes the Odyssey, and that's the only thing I know about him.
It's the only thing
and
you
that's
remember.
a very two-dimensional character. But you are a real person who I have met multiple times, and multiple times have talked about your love of the Odyssey.
With all kinds of other hopes and dreams that you don't seem that interested in.
Speaking of secrets, all of your hopes and dreams and things, your NPCs are tools. And a thing about making an interesting NPC, and if you do happen to build them up, you've got Slagathar. Slagathar?
Slagathor. I don't know,
Slagathor.
I came up with it at the moment.
Okay, Slagathor is there, and he's really important for the plot. He's got a bunch of secrets. How do you signal to these players that there is more to Slagathor than just his ridiculous name?
This is where my campaigns are obtuse and frustrating.
Here's a sales
Because
pitch.
genuinely, the answer is I don't. And again, we talk about simulated realism, right? It's gonna come up if it comes up, and if it doesn't, maybe it never happens in the campaign. And honestly, I've had games where my players have met people who are quite complex, and the plot's just not needed to go any further with that person, so those other layers have just never been revealed. I don't like having somebody like offhandedly note that they maybe have a dark brooding past, right? Like it needs to, in the same way that I don't trauma dump in front of people who I've only just met. I keep that to myself until maybe we've known each other for quite some time, or we happen to be in a circumstance where it becomes relevant. A great example is I had it was a character, actually, and they were from a noble lineage. This didn't come up until maybe 12 sessions in. And one of the other characters was a former noble. He would have heard of my family name, but he had two family names. So he just went by the other one so that the noble thing didn't come up until suddenly it did come up. Because it just hadn't been relevant. And I treat my NPCs exactly the same way. I don't clue people in that there's maybe something else to uncover until where the plot is taking them brings them to that something extra. And then it's like the world opens up immensely, and my players have that beautiful solipsistic moment. We talk about realism, and I talk about how I go for simulated realism as much as I reasonably can. This is one of the big ways I do it. It feels way more organic, and it makes those NPCs feel way more alive. Yeah, it means that the ones they never get that deep on don't feel as memorable, don't stick around in the players' minds as much, but the ones that do, they talk about for years.
Well, here's my hot take, is that is some of the worst GM advice we have given on this podcast.
Don't do that, by the way. I can do that because I've been playing with a stable group of people for like nearly a decade at this point. More than a decade, actually. That's the level of like, they know that that's what I'm going for in my worlds, and they can work with that. If you do that for randoms, they're going to be like, why is every NPC so flat? If I'm running, a one-shot for members of the public or a paid game or something like that, that's when I'm going to be, if they meet a farmer who implies that he has a dark and brooding past.
Exactly. Now, that is my very strong opinion. When you're saying that when your players meet your NPCs, you will keep things back, you'll have these layers, you won't immediately trauma dump on some strangers. Let me tell you now, Matt, that every NPC my players meet is having a terrible day and is just in that emotional zone to trauma dump or share their secrets, because if you have an incredible secret that you've worked super hard on and it never gets out, it may as well have never existed. And you gave the example...
All I heard, sorry, was super hard on, but continue.
You gave the example...
That's what happens when you take sildenafil.
You gave the example of your character who was a noble that didn't come out for like 12 sessions. Let me introduce you to one of my favorite NPCs who has absolutely no stakes in any story. He's called Kevin. And when you meet Kevin, he's a blacksmith's apprentice, and the first thing he does as soon as you walk into his shop is he tells you about his crush, Charity. She works as one of the acolytes at the temple down the road, and she's really cool. You should go and say hi to Charity, and maybe talk about how cool I am, but don't say that Kevin sent you, and don't mention me at all, if that's okay. And immediately, every player I've ever had that has met Kevin has been like, we're going to get you together with Charity. And they will head down the road to this temple and they'll meet Charity. And as soon as they meet Charity, Charity's also having a day. She's got a lot of feelings bubbling up, and she's literally just a gender-swapped version of Kevin. As soon as the players show up, she's like, hi, welcome to the temple. Have you been to the blacksmithy down the road? It's Kevin's first day at work. Is he doing okay? Can you check on him? Don't let him know that I sent you, though. He's really cool. The amount of investment, Matt, I have managed to milk multiple sessions of deep investment from characters, and it's just, that was it. It was a dumb voice and then just sharing a secret.
So, I mean, this is so funny because you talk about player investment, and that is actually the exact reason that I do things the way I do them. For essentially the opposite reason. I'll give an example of an NPC that my players just drifted on past, that they've never interacted with any further, right? They bump into people as they're sharing the road, and, they camp down for the night with them. This is absolutely nothing unusual. It's this husband and wife who have a young son who looks to be, he's just a little bit above walking age and is clearly a little bit of a handful, and he's quite big for his age. And I describe this all quite subtly. I don't say he's quite big for his age, because that already sounds like I'm kind of leading into something. Instead, as they sat around the fire, the guy, he seems a little bit, he's a bit lubricated and a little bit bawdy, and he makes this really off-color joke about, and I can do this, by the way, because I run a game for very close friends where this is not an unacceptable thing to say at the table. But he makes this off-color joke about how his wife's breast milk must be incredible somehow because of how big their boy is getting. And he's saying it in this real proud tone that a villager probably would. It wouldn't be a totally unusual thing to say. Now, my players, I guarantee if I asked, they'd probably still remember that guy, because it was such an odd thing to say. It was about the only memorable thing about him. If they'd scratched off just a little bit of the sheen over top of that encounter, if they'd pulled on that thread just a little bit further, there was this whole potential thing that they could have uncovered within the setting of essentially giant lineage that had been long extinct was still being carried through a few individuals who otherwise appeared to be human, and elsewhere in the world is this group of people that are trying to bring the giants back and are wanting to identify these individuals with that giant lineage. My players never touch that whatsoever. The reason I bring this up in the context of player buy-in is if they had thought, I wonder if there's something else here. If they had maybe hung out a little bit more, or maybe later on down the line they hear about, some kid getting abducted and they decide to look into it, and it turns out that kid is a bit, big for his age. And then they go, we met that other kid who was a bit big for his age. And then when they do finally uncover what all of that was, again, it feels so real. And they're totally invested because they had to do the work. They had to put in the effort to get to that part of the story. Now, it's a very fine balancing act between pulling that off and not having it, and making sure that the world isn't so obtuse that the players never get involved in anything and just have a bad time.
You are walking that line really, really finely. And my question to you is going to be, if people knowing about these secret giant lineages is critical to your plot, How do you draw somebody in immediately to try and find out more about a player? Now, I've got opinions about this.
Again, the answer is I in a weird way, the answer is I don't. But what I do is I crank up the frequency. Instead of popping and bumping into this one person where this thing happens to take place on the road, they come across like 8 instances that kind of nod towards these, kids who are slightly big for their age or what have you. And maybe a character has a little bit of buy-in on that as well. Like they're looking for their long-lost brother who they recall being quite big for his age. And, that's how I'm going to do it. And I'm also going to start, if that's the most important thing in the campaign, if that's one of the more central pieces to the story, that's also something I'm going to introduce pretty early on rather than... this was sort of on the road between 2 arcs of a campaign.
So you'll throw
the main story.
Lots of NPCs at the characters until one finally sticks, and they're
I like to think of my players as fish in a sea of hooks, and they can decide which one that they latch onto.
That's beautiful.
But they have to decide.
Yep.
But the sea is full of hooks.
That's a valid strategy.
Yeah.
Like, just keep throwing characters at these people until they bite.
And I want to go way, way back before to something we were talking about where we talk about specific things to make characters memorable. The thing that I love going in for, we talk about accent. I specifically go with idiolect. Which is basically, it's Jackie Kennedy. It's someone with such a distinctive way of talking. Christopher Walken is a classic example. Their way of talking is so distinctive that it's unmistakable. And as soon as you hear it a second time, you're like, oh, it's that guy. That does 2 things. 1, it makes them memorable. 2, makes it really easy for me to remember what their voice was in case we don't happen to come across them for, several months worth of sessions, which happens a lot in my great big sprawling long form games.
Now, I have a top tip for game masters who may not do as many voices or accents as we do, and really need to make a character memorable. There's one thing you can do that will work 100% of the time to get your players invested in an NPC, and it's really easy. Just let your players know they're hot.
That also works.
Hits every time. Every time.
It does work. It really does work. Then...
I think... Is there anything else you want to add, Matt?
I really don't. Sorry, I was just imagining a hot NPC. And I was trying to figure out what to call them, and all I could think of was Slagathor.
Finishing off on Slagathor, the sexy NPC. I've been Mark.
I've been Matt.
That's the One Shot Show. Thank you for listening.
If you like what you just heard, feel free to support us on Patreon. Every little bit helps. Go to patreon.com/oneshotshow.